Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and you are listening to the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, where we give you the most zesty, flavorful, theological ingredients, put it right there in your earbuds, audiological style, so that you can brew your own zesty faith. Thank you for joining us this week. Thank you for listening to the podcast. And most of all, before we jump into a conversation with Aaron Simmons about the end of religion from that partnership conference titled the same at Villanova University, before we jump into that, I just want to invite you all to join me out and about. That's right, at Drury University, November 5th to 7th at the Subvert the Norm 3 conference. I'm going to be at Subvert the Norm. I'm going to be there, and we're going to have some podcastery. We're going to have a ton of stuff. But the thing is, the Subvert the Norm 3 is happening this year, November 5th to 7th, at Drury University, right over there in Missouri. And I think you should all come join us. Not only will some of the longtime regular Subvert the Norm people be there, like Pete Rollins, Jack Caputo, Sarah Moody, but you're going to be joined this year by a whole host of new speakers, one of which is just Catherine. That's right, Catherine Keller's going to be at Subvert the Norm. Cameron Carter's going to be there from Duke. He's like my favorite professor at Duke. And I say that as a Wake Forest alum who can't stand the Duke Blue Devils. But I will be having some Demon Deacon assistants, because former professor at Wake Forest, Alton B. Pollard's going to be there. He's now the dean at Howard University School of Divinity, but he did teach at Wake Forest. And I got to hear him lecture and teach there when I was there, and he's awesome, like amazing awesome. So it's going to be packed full of excitement, tons of fun right there in Drury University over there, Springfield, Missouri. You should come. And here's the thing. If you use the code when you're getting your ticket, HBC STN, which Homebrewed Christianity Subvert the Norm, then you get the best discount possible. That's right. Like, normally you're going to go get your ticket, and you're like, oh, I'm going to pay for this event. I wonder what it costs to go to this event. And then you go over there, and you go to the website, Subvert the Norm, and you go to buy your ticket, and you're like, oh, man, what am I going to do? I have already missed the early bird special. I don't know what to do. Boom. Use HBC STN, then you get $30 off. But you could be asking yourself, I hear you, deacons. You're saying, Trip, is there going to be a live podcast at Subvert the Norm? And the answer is yes. Not only that, but Elder of the Okie, that's right, Charlie Sheldon, is brewing up some special beers for the evening. And if that wasn't enough, then let me tell you something else. The day before Subvert the Norm starts, on November 4th, there's going to be a special pregame Theology Nerd Boot Camp with me and Jack Caputo. We are going to do a boot camp called When Philosophers Talk About God. That boot camp is going to be so nerdalicious, so packed full of just geekery, that I dare you to come. Yeah. And you can get tickets for that over at homebrewchristianity.com. One-day event, all day long, rocking it out, nerding out, geeking out with Jack Caputo and I, talking about what philosophers talk about when they talk about God. Anyway, now we're going to jump in to this podcast. Aaron Simmons talking about the end of religion, and then after he presents his paper from the End of Religion Conference, where he partnered with Villanova University's religion department. Following that, you hear a panel discussion with Aaron, with Jeff Robbins, with Jack Caputo, and Merrill Westphal. I hope you enjoy it, and I'm going to post the lectures by Jack and Merrill back to back. We're going to post them rather quickly, and so just look at the website and download the audio, because we're going to put them all there, and then Greg and I are going to get together for a little End of Religion TNT spectacular. All right, head on over to homebrewedchristianity.com. Make sure you leave us a message on the Speak Pipe. If you're going to get books, click through the Amazon link, because we get a kickback. Make sure you've pre-ordered Tripp's book. Yeah, he wrote this book called Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus. And, Lord, Liar, Lunatic, or Just Freaking Awesome. Yeah, you could pre-order it right now. And then you can read about what I said about Jesus. there may or may not be an entire chapter that is more or less talking about John Cobb in it. I can't say it's the whole chapter because the publishers were like, we can't have a whole chapter dedicated to John Cobb. And I was like, a whole chapter? I have like hours and hours of podcasts dedicated to John Cobb. And he's one of the JCs. Yeah. But you know who are two of the others? Just Catherine Keller and Jack Caputo, all at Subvert the Norm. So you should go. Boom, boom, boom. And Catherine is like the president of John Cobb's fan club. She was like, Tripp, look, I'm his real president of this fan club. And I was like, that's fine, Just Catherine. You can be president. I'll be like whatever incoming moderator or whatever that title is that fan clubs have for who can be next. But yeah, homebrewchristianity.com. Go there. Tweet me at Triple. Peace out.
The title of my talk tonight is Whose Christianity, Which Postmodernism? Seeking a Theory of Religious Practice. Let me begin with some disclaimers. First, I am not a theologian, and I have no desire to come out as one. But tonight I will likely sound more like one than I ever have before. And I pray the theologians in the audience will forgive me. The reason I claim not to be a theologian is because I don't think I'm good enough to be one. Second, I'm entirely convinced that philosophy of religion must become less narrowly theistic and specifically Christian. I endorse and support comparative and cross-cultural work that's currently being done across philosophy and theology, and in fact, I'm currently working with colleagues from other religious traditions on a book dealing with cross-cultural religious epistemology right now. However, tonight I'll be working entirely out of my own Christian tradition. Third, I am all for technical debates and philosophical scholarship, but tonight I aim to be just a little bit more personal. In fact, some of the theologically sounding stuff that I'll be saying is precisely due to this personal quality of my talk tonight. But I consider this not as theology, and definitely not as pastoral, whether in good or bad senses. But I instead take it to be more in line with what Merrill described in 1973 as personal philosophy, which was part of what he described as the prophetic approach to philosophy of religion. So that's more where I see what my talk is meant to be in line with and where I'm coming out of for this evening. All right, so having begun, let's begin. I'm a Christian. Well, as Kierkegaard says, I'm trying to become one. And I'm a postmodernist. Well, at least I think I am. Whether I count as a Christian and as a postmodernist all depends on who you ask. Indeed, in many ways, the fact that I identify as a Christian disqualifies me for many as a postmodernist. And the fact that I identify as a postmodernist disqualifies me for many as a Christian. So here's the deal. I'm a Pentecostal Christian who is a professional philosopher of religion, and I think that the basic theses of postmodernism are probably true. This complicated identity is not an easy thing to maintain, and I'm not sure I'm even up to it, but I hope that I am. And I think that it matters that I try to live in light of this hope. Tonight, I'm going to do my best to explain why I think this is the case. I'm going to provide an account of what I think is at least one version of what faith in a postmodern age might look like, and it's the version that I find occurring in my own life. I'm increasingly persuaded that offering a philosophical account of the relationship between postmodernism and religion, especially Christian faith, must find traction in one's own life. I don't mean this in an egoistic way such that my own life would now be a case of special pleading, but as an existential one, such that lived existence is the context of meaning for the claims offered regarding postmodernity and religion. Simply put, what Kierkegaard asked about inquiry more generally when he was only 22 years old, we should specifically ask of postmodern philosophy of religion. Let's listen to Kierkegaard. What I really need is to be clear about what I am to do, not what I must know, except in the way knowledge must precede all action. What use would it be to be able to propound the meaning of Christianity, to explain many separate facts, if it had no deeper meaning for myself and for my life? End quote. I do hope that in the discussion period and roundtables we'll have some time to get into the weeds about the finer points of postmodern philosophy. But for the time I have tonight, I'm simply going to lay out for you why I struggle so much in my own life to figure out what faith in a postmodern age should or even can mean on the ground as lived out in practice and in community. I will conclude with just one possible vision of what postmodern Christian faith might involve. Okay, so let me make 3 points, and then I'm going to invite you to think with me a little bit about them. Point 1, as a Christian, I'm frequently told I'm not Christian enough. Point 2, as a postmodernist, I'm frequently told I'm not postmodern enough. Point 3, the phrase, faith in a postmodern age, which is on the title of this weekend's event, it needs a comma. Those are my 3 points. All right, so about Christianity. A couple weeks ago, I was invited to get some coffee by one of the pastors at the church where my family and I have attended for about 2 years. It turned out that after a long conversation and a few cups of coffee, there was a very short thing that he wanted to say to me. Here it is. My family should look for another church. He told me that I would say I feel bad about saying this because he may be listening, but I think the chances of that are so slim that I'm okay with it. He told me that I needed to leave because I was a disruptive influence on the community and that the leadership felt that I was unwilling to come under church discipline and get on board with, in his words, the cause of the church. Two of the most influential thinkers on my own theological identity are the singer and songwriter Rich Mullins and the writer Anne Lamott. In that moment when my pastor told me that I really wasn't welcome to come to his church anymore, I found myself praying one of Anne Lamott's famously favorite prayers. Help me, help me, help me. And drawing on the theological depth of one of Rich Mullins' songs, the lyrics of which are, hold me, Jesus, because I'm shaking like a leaf. You've been King of my glory, won't you be my Prince of Peace? Help me, hold me. In other words, I needed assistance in what I would term standing fast while waiting patiently. Look, I like argument. I love argument. But there, over coffee, my facility with argumentation ran up against an existential limit. It would have been easy for me to have given reasons for why he was wrong about this or that, but the simple fact is that the conception of Christianity with which he was working, and according to which he understands the world, made no room for the questions and beliefs that I find to be inescapable in my own faith life. Such beliefs might include the intractability of the problem of evil, the frustrating reality that petitionary prayer eradicates self-sufficiency, and the difficulties that are affiliated with notions of the hiddenness of God. My questions are significantly simpler, however, and they all basically reduce to one. Why? Why is there suffering? Why is there ignorance that inspires hate? Why is there death? Why is it all just so damn hard? Why? Now, we could formulate a very specific and technical explanation of his rationale for why I had to leave the church along the lines that his theology was not appropriately haunted by the hermeneutic requirements expressed in the play of signifiers operative in his discursive community, and we could even throw in some references to Derrida, Zizek, and Badiou for good measure, which I'm not making light of that. I'm saying we could do this. Like, that's a way to offer a critique of what happened. But basically, here's the thing that matters. My beliefs and my questions challenge not only his certainty, but also his authority. What's most frustrating about the conversation with my pastor, well, I guess I should say former pastor, is that he's simply the most recent in an increasingly long line of well-intentioned Christian leaders who have told me that I'm dangerous, disruptive, problematic, threatening, or whatever to the Christian community. I've been told this by several pastors at some large churches. I've been told this by administrators and faculty of some very prestigious Christian universities. And I really don't want to mention any names, but one of those universities might be a favorite institution of the actor Will Wheaton. It's funny, though. I don't feel dangerous. I don't mean to be disruptive. I don't want to be threatening. Intentionally trying to be such things seems to me to be more about egoism than truth-seeking. Indeed, I just think conversations matter and that we should pay close attention to the fact that Jesus is frequently interruptive of the certainties by which we operate. So my questions arise out of my faith and not in opposition to it. With Anne Lamott, Rich Mullins, St. Augustine, Soren Kierkegaard, Gianni Vattimo, the Roman soldier, and probably many of you, I frequently say, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. Moreover, specifically as an open theist who affirms divine personalism, I continue to think that God responds to our confusion and questions similar to how God is presented in Isaiah 41. Come, let us reason together, saith the Lord. as I see it, my beliefs and my questions are not threatening to Christianity, but motivated by Christianity. Appeals to deconstructive phenomenology and radical hermeneutics are not required for such beliefs and questions, though they are likely to be extremely helpful for framing the questions and getting clear on what is at stake in those beliefs. That said, just a brief look at the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament conveys that questions, uncertainty, and longing are part of religious life, not a threat to it. Moses doubts God at the end of Exodus 5. Romans 4 claims that Abraham hoped against hope. Job gets angry at God. Habakkuk even accuses God of not acting in the name of justice. Further, you don't have to go to the excellent books by John Schellenberg to wrestle with the hiddenness of God. Just go to the Psalms, where God is said quite often to hide the divine face from those who seek it. Finally, when it comes to my basic question, why, I find myself in a long tradition that includes the authors of Job, Psalms, Lamentations, and Habakkuk in asking, how long, O Lord? Help me. Hold me. These are profoundly religious prayers. They do not reflect a failure of faith, but a trust in God. Again, I'm a Pentecostal. There's not a whole lot of us that go to conferences like this. I don't understand myself as an enemy of orthodoxy in the sense that's given to that term by G.K. Chesterton. I tend to identify with much of what C.S. Lewis means when he talks about mere Christianity. I consider myself to fit, in many ways, with what Tony Campolo describes as red-letter Christians. But I can express such proximity while still being quite worried about the rationalism of Chesterton, the apologetics of Lewis, and the specifics of Campolo's politics. Alternatively, I'm not very sympathetic to some of the trends in radical orthodoxy. I know this will shock Jack, but I'm not sympathetic to a lot of these trends. But I'm very sympathetic to others. I'm on record as thinking that religion with religion is probably a better option for postmodern philosophy of religion than religion without religion. But I can express such hesitation while still being committed to the inescapability of hermeneutics, the necessity of embodied perspective for all inquiry, the centrality of hospitality to ethical life, and the importance of critique as a mode of discursive rationality. Ultimately, though, despite being someone who plays at the edges of what I take to be at least an historical center of Christianity, I cling to that center as definitive of the edge upon which I stand. This is why I'm entirely fine with being a challenge to the certainty and the authority of my former pastor. And yet, in this sense, Christianity itself is why church is hard for me. Let me be clear, it's really hard. I do wish my former pastor would realize that I can be helpful for reminding the church community that the Bible might represent the greatest temptation to idolatry available for evangelicals. I wish my former pastor would celebrate that asking critical questions can help the church to be maximally oriented towards those who would otherwise be overlooked. In other words, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger stand as constant challenges to the triumphalist tendencies of Christian complacency, especially when that complacency is underwritten by political allegiances that seem to make religious existence more about reinforcing a reliable voting bloc than being interrupted by grace. Indeed, perhaps neither the road to Emmaus nor the road to Damascus lead to our contemporary churches. But this is not what my former pastor did. And yet, that he didn't do this makes complete sense given his particular conception of Christianity. As such, I do not think he's irrational or unreasonable or immoral, but just mistaken, and very regrettably so. Ultimately, I don't agree with him about this conception of Christianity, but I do continue to hope that such disagreement can find a place within the contemporary Christian community, as it certainly does in the scriptures to which Christians appeal. That said, if Christianity simply means what it means to my former pastor, then I'm not sure that I can consider myself a Christian, and I'm quite confident that I don't want to try to become one. In a song entitled Your Redneck Past, Ben Folds writes the following. I'm from Chattanooga, Tennessee. So this is actually just outside in Cleveland, Tennessee. Here's Ben Folds. If you're afraid you might discover your redneck past, there are 100 ways to cover your redneck past. Just find a place where no one knows of your redneck past. Yeah, you can easily dispose of your redneck past. You'll show them all back home. This is Islam. I expect that many of you, especially if you're trying to work through or get over or forget your own generally Christian, or more specifically in my case, your evangelical past, you might quickly say that church is hard because it's a bad idea and should rightly be abandoned, kind of like Ben Folds sort of encourages about one's redneck past. In the spirit of Peter Rollins, maybe the point's to explore the fidelity of betrayal. Perhaps the best way to get over an evangelical past is to break ties with evangelicals. Perhaps the best way to offer criticism to the church is to stop going. This response is entirely plausible to me. And accordingly, if I'm looking for a place where no one is interested in my evangelical past, then it seems to me that a postmodern philosophy of religion conference seems like a great option. We are here to talk about the end of religion, after all. Well, even though I understand why many in this situation have left the church in order to make possible some version of postmodern Christianity that makes sense to them, I simply can't trade in Christian community for postmodern colleagues, despite the fact that I usually want to. Importantly, just as it is my Christianity that ultimately compels me to challenge the version of Christianity represented by my former pastor, similarly, I can't leave the church not despite my postmodern identity, but precisely because of it. In regards to point 2, here's some thoughts on postmodernism. Postmodern philosophers of religion talk a lot about the end of things. I'm interested in interrogating the necessity of thinking about the end of religion as a way of beginning a conversation about the possibilities of faith in a postmodern age. Must the one end in order that the other begin? Here we might find something of a postmodern John the Baptist saying that one's participation in Christian community must decrease so that one's postmodern faith might increase. Reinforcing my own sense that we philosophers must get more personal, I think that sometimes postmodern philosophy of religion can miss the forest for the trees, or the faith for the discussion about faith. For my part, I think that we postmodern philosophers of religion far too often engage in complicated questions of interpretation in order to remain a step removed from the difficulty of sincere commitment operating internal to a life of religious practice. It's kind of like when writing your dissertation, you convince yourself that instead of writing today, what you really need to do is read some more. Engaging in hermeneutics is obviously essential for thinking and living well, but sometimes hermeneutic existence can invite a second-order life that can fail to find traction in what Wittgenstein would call the rough ground of a community of discourse defined by shared hope, belief, and ritual. This is not an either-or here, but simply a Kierkegaardian reminder not to forget about living while we think about best how to live. Postmodernism should propel us into our historical communities, not away from them. It should call us to critical engagement, not disregard and detachment. By the way, we should resist confusing postmodern with a term like continental here, since many philosophers not working in broadly continental traditions are nevertheless thoroughly postmodern in their approach to inquiry and existence. So for me, William Alston and Nicholas Wolterstorff say are postmodernists too. That said, what then should we mean by postmodernism, and specifically the notion of a postmodern age? Well, for Kierkegaard, an age not only marks a historical epoch, but a subjective orientation that is written into a social norm such that the subjectivity itself is at stake. What would the postmodern age then mean as concerns identity formation as claimed to be properly oriented as a result of a particular social location? Well, as with Christianity, a lot depends on who you ask. We could continue for a long time formulating an even longer list of folks to read in order to get a better sense of what postmodern is and what is at stake within it. And this is often, I think, the favored strategy of scholars working in this area. And I don't think, again, it's like an intentional attempt to avoid. I think it's because we try to make clear, well, this is the history in which we find ourselves. However, regardless of how long a list we develop and how many names we pile up, I think that Merrill Westphal's account of postmodernism is still perhaps the best definition I've seen for summarizing what minimally underlies all of these various foci and emphases. For Westphal, postmodernism is simply the idea that, as he says, you can't peek over God's shoulder. Notice in this definition, Westphal does not assume any sort of theism, but simply uses the notion of God's shoulder as a rhetorical shorthand for objectivity. His phrasing, though, is powerful in light of Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God, and Vattimo's extensive account of how the death of God is necessarily connected both to the fulfillment of Christianity and the increasing secularization, or the desacralization, as Jeff talked about it, of postmodern society. Tweaking Westphal's definition of it, I would simply say that postmodernism for me is the view that it is highly doubtful, probably impossible, that we can ever see things without occupying a perspective, which is at the same time subjective and socially located. That's what postmodernism means for me. Said slightly more technically, I think postmodernism is probably necessarily opposed to access internalism when it comes to justification. In other words, you have access to the reasons that then justify the beliefs that you hold. But it is entirely open to metaphysical realism and even correspondence theories of truth as understood according to a generally epistemic anti-realist outlook. There are, of course, a wide variety of realisms and anti-realism. I once heard a paper about like the variety of realisms, and another paper on the variety of naturalisms, and there's like 17 of them and stuff. There's a lot. But in broad strokes, we might say that if God's vantage point has historically been synonymous with the idea of seeing things sub specie aeterni, then saying that we can't peek over God's shoulder suggests that, as Kierkegaard says, quote, existence is a system for God, but not for any existing individual, end quote. Even if we correct Kierkegaard's statement and say, as he should have said, existence might be a system for God, since it is not clear, for me at least, where we would stand to say that it is this way for God. Even then, we're still left with the messiness of historical existence as a living in a world and a living toward social ends. Notice also that when Westphal says we can't peek over God's shoulder, his choice of the term peek indicates, rightly it seems to me, that we would have to sneak to take a look, because we probably shouldn't be standing there. My son's currently reading this, learn to read book, and it has a lot about sneak, peek, and take a look, and all these terms. And for me, I try and explain to him why this is great. This is Westphalian postmodernism. So we've got to sneak a look. You've got to sneak around God to look over God's shoulder. In other words, there's something wrong or maybe even disobedient with our attempt to occupy such a non-perspective for existing individuals. Assuming objectivity is not just bad epistemologically, it's bad morally. In this sense, then, for postmodernism, epistemology immediately opens onto ethics, or said slightly more theologically, and echoing much of Jean-Luc Mampillon's work, to forget our fallenness and finitude is not only to display intellectual arrogance, but probably to engage in idolatry. Here we stand, peering through a glass darkly. Ultimately, there are two things that I take to be true about postmodernism. First, postmodernism is necessarily a reminder of some important things about us as inquirers. We are finite, limited, embodied, historical, fragile, and often vicious. Second, postmodernism does not necessarily say anything about reality or God, except as those claims are indexed to inquirational locations. Now, putting these 2 points together, we can see that a postmodern age, then, is one that should be guided by epistemic humility, but not necessarily by any specific theological doctrine or metaphysical account, or lack thereof. Drawing on the above Kierkegaardian emphasis, then, I'm going to refer to this general view of postmodernism to which I subscribe as Kierkegaardian postmodernism. This basic insight of Kierkegaardian postmodernism as concerns the possibilities of faith in a postmodern age is that we must take seriously where we find ourselves and realize that all God talk is said by someone while located within a community. This is what my former pastor was unwilling to admit about his own appropriation of Christianity, namely that it is his, and it's located in a very specific interpretive history shared by his community. The realization that perspectivalist inquiry is it's probably inescapable, has led, though, to a rather stark division in the philosophical and theological communities, in the debates in which those of us engaged in these play. On the one hand, there are those who have resisted postmodernism and say that if we're stuck within our own perspectives, this should motivate us to cling fast to divine revelation that ruptures and reorients such perspectives towards the objective truth. So let's call this the objectivist solution to Kierkegaardian postmodernism. The objectivist solution does not necessarily reject perspectivalism for human knowing, though it often does, but it merely retains a thick conception of epistemic realism as a result of divine revelation. We can know things as God knows them, and we can know that we know them. Why? Because God reveals such knowledge to us. Accordingly, even if we never escape our own perspectives, God allows us to know absolute truth with a capital T within those perspectives. Sometimes I've referred to this general view as operating according to what I term a cataphatic orthodoxy. Insofar as the claims to determinacy are held with near epistemic certainty, such that those who would reject the claims are then labeled as irrational, unreasonable, and probably immoral. On the other hand, so that's the objectivist solution. On the other hand, there are those who do embrace postmodernism and then go on to say that since we can't escape our perspectives, we should stop acting like there's some truth with a capital T beyond them. Let's term this the subjectivist solution. On this account, the reason we can't peek over God's shoulder is because there's no shoulder over which we can peek. All truth in revelation is lowercase. According to the subjectivist solution, postmodernism does entail metaphysical and theological claims, but nearly always in deflationary or negative ways. Accordingly, I sometimes have referred to this general view as operating according to an apophatic orthodoxy. Now, with these two possible solutions to the potential problems that perspectivalism presents, that is a lot of P words. Sorry about that sentence. I find myself unable to affirm either option. Simply put, if the subjective solution is taken as entailed by postmodernism itself, then I'm not a postmodernist. Alternatively, if the objective solution is presented as necessary for Christian philosophers, then I'm going to have trouble considering myself a Christian philosopher. But there's a third option, and probably like 17 others. But at least a third. Here it is. According to the Kierkegaardian postmodernism that I endorse, aspects of the subjective solution are not necessarily entailed, and aspects of the objective solution are not entirely rejected. Instead, both are options depending on what else one is willing to grant and what other bullets one is willing to bite. For me, my version of postmodernism pulls me toward the subjectivist solution. But my version of Christianity pulls me toward the objectivist solution. Must I choose? Absolutely. I don't think so. For postmodern philosophers of religion, revelation with a capital R and truth with a capital T are both possible, but only as lived. That is, as interpreted, affirmed, put into practice, etc. Here we're able to maintain the postmodern resistance to access internalism, but maintain the possibility of a realist view of truth. This is a postmodernism with which I can get on board, because it does not require me to check my particular existential bags at the door, but instead allows me to bring my context, my community, my commitments, and my convictions with me, but then to realize that they are never protected from critical scrutiny. Again, I don't think you need postmodernism for that, but it certainly helps. So let's conclude by talking about the importance of commas. Derrida has a book about ellipses, so I figure commas are open for discussion. Let me summarize what I've said up to this point. Christianity and postmodernism are both difficult because they are not singular conceptions. Religious belief, like philosophical theories, are always someone's, but that someone is always located in a community in which such theories and beliefs are either legitimated or contested. It's easy to remove yourself from that contestation and occupy spaces of legitimation, right? Just with a different community. But I've claimed that both Christianity and postmodernism recommend tarrying with the challenge rather than fleeing from it. How then do we stand fast while waiting patiently? How do we welcome the criticism while serving the community? How do we integrate without resolving the tension that is constitutive for Christian and postmodern subjectivity? These are very hard questions. I don't have good answers for them because I think that they are only truly answerable by undertaking them, as Kierkegaard would say, a task for a lifetime. As Anne Lamott says, she seeks grace, eventually. And Derrida says we must engage in learning to live, finally. Help me. Hold me. I know that some postmodern Christian philosophers like being dangerous, but I don't. I think that Christianity is dangerous enough. Similarly, some postmodern philosophers like being radical, but I don't. I think postmodernism is radical enough without having to up the ante at every turn. Ultimately, I don't think that postmodern faith requires an end of religion. I think it just requires that religion be allowed to be as dangerous as it already is. So for me, I am uninterested in, quote, faith in a postmodern age, whereby the object of my faith ultimately ends up looking like postmodernism itself. Rather, I want faith, in a postmodern age, such that the quest is now, how do we be faithful where we are as postmodernists? In other words, faith is not made more radical in postmodernism, but postmodernism is the historical site in which we find ourselves wrestling with the radicality of faith. Christianity and Kierkegaardian postmodernism can work together to reinforce this comma. How so? Well, I want to try to answer this question somewhat performatively by concluding with one possible vision. So I don't want that purity that Jeff is worried about. I'm with him on being very resistant to that. But here's one vision of how to think of faith, in a postmodern age. This is an account that's consistent both with my postmodernism and with my Christianity, and constantly destabilized by both. Here's the thought. It's simple. Either God is trouble or God is nothing. For me, postmodern Christian faith is encapsulated in this exclusive disjunction. Too often, God is presented as the authorizer of the way things are supposed to be. God is like the ultimate Miss Manners, though in the evangelical tradition it's going to be a Mr. Manners, for all the reasons that Jeff, I thought, very nicely explained. These manners are usually taught by churches and Christian schools that claim to stand for Christian truth or Christian morality. Yet allowing God to function as something like the enforcer of the way things should be all too often reduces God to mere reinforcement of the way things happen to be for us within our communities. As David Foster Wallace reminds us in This Is Water, the best way of discouraging thought about something is to claim that it's obviously true, and so not in need of any thought. As he says, don't forget, this is water. This is water. Again, I think that the risk to my former pastor was not only regarding his certainty, but his authority. If God just stands as the ultimate hammer with which to smash objections and criticism of the way that Christians do things, as those former pastors and college administrators seem to indicate, then God really is nothing. By nothing, I don't mean that God doesn't exist, but simply that it no longer matters if God does. If God is basically a rubber stamp for our own conceptions for pious living, then why do we need the stamp in the first place? If there were no God, then we would still likely live this way because there's some power or benefit to us within our community for doing so. God's names are frequently invoked to underwrite public policy, church practice, and social discipline, and all too often serve to justify the exclusion of those who don't fit with what is obviously the way God wants things. If God is an excuse for complacency, then God is nothing. We can be complacent quite easily without divine aid. If God justifies the way things are because they happen to fit the way that a particular group thinks they should be, then God is nothing. Those folks will likely keep thinking the same thing as long as it benefits them to do so. C.S. Lewis said a lot of smart things, and one of the smartest is when he claimed that very rarely does stupidity become wisdom because we associate God with it. Such association, he thinks, will just make us look dumb and God unnecessary. I think he's right. God is trouble for anyone who would think that the obvious for Christianity simply is obvious. God is trouble for anyone who would assume that Christian ethics is easily identified with a particular political orientation. God is trouble for those who would expect God to be safe to the way they already think. Here's another smart thing that C.S. Lewis said. Aslan is not a tame lion. In other words, God is trouble for anyone who thinks they have God figured out. Just ask Job as he faces the whirlwind, having lost everything. Just ask Stephen as he sees heaven open as the rocks rain down upon him. Ask Abraham as he hears God's voice just before plunging the knife into his son. Ask Mary as she follows God's command and goes to tell Joseph. Ask the adulterous woman as she looks up and sees her accusers have gone and Jesus remains. I'm not appealing to these narratives as evidence for the truth of my account. That's why I don't think I'm doing theology, by the way. but rather as narratives that illuminate the way that the texts of the Christian tradition serve to destabilize the complacency that so often operates in the Christian tradition. How then is faith, in a postmodern age possible? As lived, as embodied, as shared, but as disruptive, as challenging, as destabilizing. Postmodern faith does not require an end of religion, but it does require the end of thinking that philosophy is the proper criterion by which faith should be judged. In this way, the subjectivist solution to the perspectivalism of Kierkegaardian postmodernism might be more ontotheological in the bad sense, not the radical sense, than classical theism ever was. So we move forward as Christians and postmodernists with existential confidence and yet epistemic humility. Here I stand, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer rightly says, but I can always do otherwise. Hence the risk, hence the trust, hence the faith, in a postmodern age. This is what help me, hold me. So let me end with another favorite prayer by Anne Lamott. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Questions? I guess what the panel says questions.
This will be very quick. Is it not the case that the two prayers of Anne Lamott are in fact presented as a single prayer, and that to pray is to say thank you, thank you, thank you, help, help, help?
Thank you, thank you, thank you, help, help, help. Yeah. And this is, for me, the oscillation that radical theology wants to present, but I've been trying to say, look, I'm with the oscillation, but the oscillation occurs internal to my Christian personalist account of the divine. She has a book that just came out where she says her three favorite prayers. She's added one. Help me, thank you, wow. And I think that wow is also pretty fantastic, because that's where the mystery of the divine shows up. But not in a sort of skeptical theist view like analytic theology often will present, but in, I think, a deconstructive, radical way. A wow in the sense of, like Levinas means when he says, when I engage the face of the other, I can't predict what the other's going to say. This is terrifying. For me, and I've elaborated on this elsewhere, part of why I cling to a personalist account of the divine is because I actually think God might laugh at us. So the risk of singing in the shower, for me, pretty low. The risk of singing in front of people, you notice I didn't sing the Rich Mullin lyrics, like that would be all bad. It's because y'all would laugh at me. So part of why I think risk, trust, disruption, help me, thank you, wow, is part of, for me, why I stay internal to the tradition which I found myself religiously, rather than saying that postmodernism causes me to jump ship.
Questions? I'll ask one. Many of us in the room have experienced the sort of alienation you're talking about, the sort of pushing out. And our response in some cases has been fairly negative, the hiding away, done with it. How do you expect to find, scale of 10, you find a congregation, a community that will embrace that sort of twin narrative you've got?
Yeah, and notice, I wanted to make very clear that though I disagree with my former pastor, I don't think he is irrational or immoral. Now, I disagree rabidly with some of the ethics that are deployed in the community, right? So I think that the realities by which those are then deployed in communities more largely are immoral. But I'm trying to make very clear that he, as a representative of a view that is legitimated and coherent in the community, is not something then that we should just say, I have nothing to do with this. Right? I'm trying to keep him as an interlocutor, if that makes sense. Right? He too is that widow, the orphan, the stranger for we postmodern philosophers. Right? At least I see it. That said, I want to make sure that I similarly don't make it look like those who have engaged this sort of alienation, this ostracization, this marginalization at the hand of the church, whether it be for being intellectuals, right, which is more kind of where I find myself, or whether it be for identity categories themselves, right, because you're gay or because you find yourself, embracing communism as a better social vision, right? Whatever the reason that you've experienced that kind of ostracization, I'm also wanting to say it is entirely reasonable to me that one would say, I want nothing more to do with this, right? So I want to make that very clear. I'm not at all saying, here's the right way to go. I'm saying, no, this is where I find myself, right? And we can do philosophy about, well, is there arguments for that? Is it maybe a better way? I don't even want to commit to that, though. So all that to say, how scale of 1 to 10? I don't know. I will say I have found it in various times in my life. But the various times are where, again, remember I said at one point that how we hash this stuff out is going to depend on what else we're willing to commit to and what other bullets we're willing to bite. So, for example, I once decided that it was not okay, one of those times where a church was asking me to leave, and I decided, if I'm going to leave, it's not okay to me that the segregation that occurs every Sunday morning, usually at about 11 a.m., continues in my own life. And so my wife and I decided that we were going to look for an African-American Pentecostal community. They welcomed us with open arms. And it was interesting there, though, because socially and politically, there were a lot more points of allegiance. Theologically, relative to specifics internal to my own, there were actually less identity. But it was a community that welcomed us without any problem. It wasn't an issue. Right? The pastor and I had coffee many times. I've also been at churches that to anyone else would seem like the very kind of conservative evangelical community that I'm worried about. And yet the pastor would be so aware and reflective and critically engaged that he and I would have, for example, in this one case, such a deep personal relationship that built from our critiquing and challenging each other, that in some sense, existing in that community became easy for me. But it became easy because my conversation partner was maintained, even internal to a community that then didn't see me as disruptive, right? So I'm not at all saying this is a wash across the board. I will say I no longer, I don't think, use the term evangelical as a self-description, but that doesn't mean that I then am not an evangelical. I know Rachel Held Evans, I think last week, said she's no longer an evangelical. I don't want to do that. I'd rather talk about my evangelical past, hence the Ben Folds, and my Pentecostal identity. Right? For me, that's how I make sense of where I find myself.
I'll let you pass the mic now.
Thanks for your talk. I just wonder if the way you seem to be using postmodern seems to cast the net a little too broad. So, John Locke, denies the category of essence as being useful and says this is kind of just idle thought. And that seems to be, well, if essence is kind of integral to achieving objectivity, is John Locke a postmodernist? And then, you could say similar things about David Hume and Immanuel Kant, but the problem is, if those guys aren't modern, then I don't know who is. You understand the question?
Oh, absolutely, I do. I get it a lot, and I think it's a good question. I'd make two distinctions. One is I think it's important, for me at least, that modernism and postmodernism can be cashed out in a bunch of different ways. So, and I usually thought, I actually had a whole section of the paper that I dropped because I thought it was getting too technical, and I was trying hard to keep it all generally at the same spot. There's also a line where I say we could go on with a bunch of names about how to add it up. I actually had a page where I did that. I thought, I can't make fun of myself, right? So I dropped it a second. But one way to cash out modernism and postmodernism is to think of this as somehow historically identified. So we say, well, here are these great examples of this historical epic period move, whatever, and here are these other great examples, and so we've got to figure out, well, what is it that makes sense of the fact that they're in two different spaces? I'm not a historian of philosophy, though I hope that my philosophy is historically right. I read that work because I want to make sure I'm not saying false things. But I'm not a historian of philosophy, and so I'm more interested, when I use the term postmodernism, I'm thinking of a philosophical view. A position that one could say in a truth table, true or false. And so for me, postmodernism, I have no problem if Shakespeare's a postmodernist or if Augustine's a postmodernist. I think Jack actually made a compelling case that Augustine might be in various ways. So I have no problem with this sort of historical wideness that happens. I'm more worried about a different version of the net too wide. Is simply this. Those very objectivists that I talk about, the objectivist solution to Kierkegaardian postmodernism says, hey, even if we're perspectival, God ruptures this, gives us absolute truth, right? Some sort of sensus divinitatis or something like this, right? Here's my worry. As long as you're a fallibilist about your truth claim, it looks like you could fit my definition of postmodernism. So if William Lane Craig, say, or Richard Swinburne, right, great examples of what I would consider the objectivist solution people, if they simply say, of course we could be wrong, then don't they count as a postmodernist? And here's where I'm going to say, yeah, I don't think so. Because I'm building a lot into when I say it says stuff about us as inquirers, about our embodied finitude, vicious, right? All of these things where I'm now drawing on particular moves in virtue epistemology to say our viciousness actually affects our epistemic capacities. Our embodiment is precisely where people like Catherine Malibu and many others are giving us, Judith Butler, etc., giving us really good reasons to think. Embodiment has really interesting realities relative to how it is we hold truth claims to be true. So that's where I would start saying I don't think it's too wide a net, but I will grant all day long it is a wider net than some other versions of postmodernism in play. And my worry about those wider versions, or excuse me, those narrower versions, is that what they end up doing is necessarily inscribing a metaphysics or a theology in ways that I'm saying, well, look, maybe that's what postmodernism really is, but then I'm not a postmodernist. Right? So I'm fine biting that bullet. So I'm trying to sketch why I think it's a word worth fighting for. Zizek says that fundamentalism is so bad that Christian legacy has to be wedded, like pulled back from fundamentalists. It's too important, let them have it. I actually want to say that about postmodernism. Postmodernism is such a useful heuristic and hermeneutic tool for thinking well about things like faith and action and morality and virtue and politics and critique. It's too important then to let it be so narrow that it then entails particular views on all of those things. That's where, for me, I'm gonna stand with confidence and then say I could be very much wrong with this.
Now they're switching, moving people around and all that kind of jazz, and then you're going to get the Q&A with Aaron Simmons, Greg Horton moderating in my stead, and Jack Caputo, Jeffrey Robbins, Merrill Westphal. It's a hoot nanny of nerdy proportions. Enjoy.
What we're going to do is we're going to have a panel discussion here. And we've got a couple of questions that have been sent in, and we have a few rules we have to abide by. And I've talked to everybody but Merrill, and I apologize, Merrill, you were talking to Jack, so I didn't get with you. But what we're going to do to move this along and to make it a little more accessible to everybody, including our live stream, and then later on, Homebrewed Christianity is going to do 2 podcasts based on this as well, and make the audio available, is when you say something like, so you're doing Kierkegaard there, I'm going to make you stop, and you have 90 seconds to explain why Kierkegaard is important to everybody in the room. Because the deal is, as you know, you guys are mainly philosophy. I think Jeff is religious studies background, right? You get used to reading stuff, but as you well know, nobody reads everything. And so the idea here is you're going to... I'm sorry, Jack, I apologize. So we're going to have you explain that kind of stuff. And if you say something like ontotheology, you have 30 seconds to explain what that means to other people as well. And so in that spirit, and Tripp Fuller asked me to say this, is that we want to keep this kind of fun, but kind of serious and important too, right? Because this is really good stuff that we're talking about. So we're going to start with something that seems really obvious because you're philosophy people. Defined words, like you use it all the time. What's the definition of the word? So let's begin. I'm going to give all of you a chance to answer this one. We're talking about the end of religion. So what is religion. Is there a unifying sort of concept? Are there practices or beliefs or structures that religion actually defines? Because as you know, like Wittgenstein would say, it's doing too much work. That word is doing way too much work. So beginning with whomever wants to begin, let's go with Jack. Jack, you start and work this way. What is religion? Why does it matter?
He's written a book that answers that question.
It's a good question, obviously. I mean, it's a word that has, the word religion has come to be the word religion only in the last few centuries. In the Middle Ages, didn't quite function like that. It did not have the same kind of, it was not a genus for a lot of world historical religious species. So there's a really interesting history with the word, which is summed up in part by what Derrida once said when he referred to it as what we call in Christian Latin religion, which gives you some sense of the way the word has a history. It is an historical formation, and it drips with a certain amount of colonialism. Right? So all of that is very rich, very difficult, and we couldn't possibly do 99 seconds. In terms of the best description of religion that I've read is Tillich's, that it's a matter of ultimate concern. A religious person is someone who has been struck dumb by the mystery of the being which we ourselves are, which is the way Heidegger might put it, and is brought up short by that mystery. And it permeates everything, so it's not confined to going to church on Sunday. I myself transcribed that from Tillich's language. I give it a slightly more Dravidian account in terms of what I call the event, but that's another matter.
Okay, Meryl?
I'm inclined to think of religion more in the objective sense than in the subjective sense, although I think they're inseparable. And so I think of religion as involving, in some sense, of the sacred. And the sacred is that which becomes, for those who take it seriously, their ultimate concern. One way to try to make that a little more precise is with Rudolf Otto's term, that which is wholly other. It's a little bit hard to know just what it is that is other than, but it certainly is other than the most immediate everyday world of our experience, at least of our experience who live in the desacralized West. For many people in many centuries of human history, everyday life was every bit sacred, and there was no secular. But for us, for whom there is a domain that we can call the secular or this worldly, religion has to do with that which is wholly other or radically different. And both the monotheisms of the West and the Mideast and the pantheisms, if that's what you want to call them, of the East, the Hindu and Buddhist versions, which are not polytheistic, the more metaphysical side of those traditions, all are variations on that theme of what it is that is sacred, what it is that is wholly other.
Okay, so really quickly before you go, Jeff, you used the word desacralized, which I would like you to take about 30 seconds and explain the definition and the importance.
Yeah, well, we think of the difference between this sacred and the secular. Today, many people in human history have not made that distinction. But once you make that, then the tendency of a modern world to become more and more secular is to become less and less oriented to the sacred. And some people call that desacralization.
That was really good. I know you do this for a living, I get it, but yes.
It's copyrighted.
Fuck you, right? I love it. Jeff.
Okay, when you're asking us to do something that in the first week of classes for an introduction to religion class or a method and theory class, that we basically demonstrate to students you can't do this. And it's the standard exercise. If you've had a religious studies class, you know this. You're introduced to 20 or 30 or 50 definitions of religion, and students sort of go through the exercise of showing what's wrong with each one of these definitions of religion. And oftentimes, as Jack was mentioning, there's a kind of colonial, sort of Western, sort of imperialistic bent to many of them, a kind of sense of cultural superiority that sort of identifies a kind of Christian, Protestant version of religiosity as the norm that then applies to other religions. And the reason why that's a problem is that once that becomes the norm, that anything that deviates from that is seen as somehow inferior. Not just sort of different, but inferior and lesser form of religion. To me, the time I learned this experientially was when I went to a conference of inter-seminarians it was a group of Jews, Catholics, and Protestants, and we had a Jewish rabbi there who was our kind of guide in sort of talking about interfaith dialogue. And the topic of the conference was salvation. And the rabbi basically said, I have no interest in salvation whatsoever. Salvation's not something that concerns me as a Jew. This is a Christian concept that belongs to a Christian sense of religiosity. And that blew my mind, because at that point I was perfectly willing to accept that religion was fundamentally about salvation. So kind of being aware of the way in which a definition of terms oftentimes can hold a kind of prejudice, sort of bias that kind of blinds us to the ways in which people inhabit the world differently. So for me, if I have to sort of have an operating definition of religion, I tend to sort of think in terms of kind of worldview, to try as best I can to adopt a kind of phenomenological perspective that sees different religious traditions from the inside out. And that's why in my paper, the times I use the term religion, I kind of problematize that and saying sort of religion in general basically doesn't exist. There are only sort of different kinds of religions.
Now you just did something that it's going to be a 90-second response.
Oh my God. I try not to.
Logical. So I need you to explain phenomenology in 90 seconds.
Okay. I think it's easier. I'm going to explain phenomenology of religion rather than phenomenology. Because I saw somebody back here reading Husserl, and that would sort of take a lot more time to describe. Phenomenology of religion, I think there's sort of basic rules of studying religion, and that is that one has to understand something before you critique it. And sort of as best you are able, you want to put yourself in someone else's shoes and allow religion to speak from inside out. So the test of a phenomenological understanding of different religious traditions is if, as you're describing that religion, is if a religious adherent of that tradition can recognize themselves in that description. So that's what I mean by phenomenology of religion.
Yeah, I'm with Jeff at the level of this question may be unanswerable in the way it's asked. However, I think that Jack has given a really nice sort of historical genealogy of what the term can mean. Merrill's giving, I think, a sort of philosophical account of what it can mean. Jeff is in problematizing those meanings and saying that they themselves betray the histories that we occupy. So I don't have a definition other than this to say. And this is a paper I recently wrote trying to bring philosophy of religion into conversation with religious studies or the academic study of religion, which often I think there's a real difference of the literatures, of the conferences, of the way that they engage. And so I think that what Jeff just said about the fact that what is religion is a question we ask almost always at the beginning of intro to religion courses or intro to religious studies courses or something. It's almost never a question that is asked at the beginning of a textbook in philosophy of religion. In fact, it almost always starts with arguments for the existence of a theistic God. And I know Merrill actually has taught philosophy of religion in a way that challenges this approach. But this is a pretty typical way to teach philosophy of religion. What we mean by God is, the omni-God of classical theism. And then we talk about arguments for, challenges to, problems of evil, faith and reason questions, etc., which then never get into the question of what is the it that we're talking about? What is the religion we mean when we philosophize about religion? And so I would simply say I don't have an answer to the question other than I think it's a question that philosophers have to start asking and learning from colleagues in academic departments of religion and religious studies to help us think about how that conversation can look in productive ways. So,
can I ask a follow-up question?
Absolutely.
So Jack's in a unique position that he was in a department of philosophy for a very long time and then went to a department of religious studies at Syracuse. And so that point that Aaron's making about kind of problematizing the term of religion, is that something that you sort of witnessed in your different careers, Villanova and Syracuse?
At Syracuse, I did. But not. I mean, I was in the philosophy department. I didn't exactly teach philosophy of religion in the philosophy department. I took courses of canon philosophy. Syracuse, it was a constant debate, but not in my experience in philosophy.
Okay, so since we're having an entire conference on the end of this thing that's hard to define, and I know we try to like mini and smart for freshmen, and then you work from there. Why does the end of religion matter, and is it a good thing or a bad thing? And we'll go backwards this time, so we'll start with Aaron.
So here, the sort of favorite thing that academics do, not just philosophers, but philosophers in particular, is to answer questions by saying, well, it depends. I did this, I think, 3 times in my paper. Well, it depends on who you ask. These people say, these other people say. I think if by religion you mean the kind of thing that Jeff has described as dangerously misogynistic, nested necessarily in imperial histories, committed and wedded to what Jack often will refer to as these histories of violence, which is why the strong theology that Jack talks about is not just stable and determinate, but it is stable and, you might say, the rock against which others are then broken, right? And I think that if that's what we mean by religion, yeah, then religion probably should end in ways that would open. Jeff referred to a guy named Gianni Vattimo who makes the claim that you need the death of God for the possibility of real religion, of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, etc., to flourish as ways of life committed to these texts that operate in the traditions, rather than these histories of power, these histories of dominance, etc. So if that's what we mean by religion, power, violence, self-protective theological discourse, then yeah, religion should end. But again, my view is, at least within Christianity, and I'd be entirely, I think, right to say in the vast majority of world religions, there are versions of those religions that I would say, look, same is true for Judaism, Islam, Hindu, Baha'i, whatever it might be, Taoists, to say, look, we want that kind of religion to end precisely so what we mean by being Buddhist or being Hindu can flourish. And I think that's where, when you'll hear even politically calls for, it's usually cast out in political rhetoric, which I think is dangerous. We call for moderate, people in a religion to speak against the more extreme versions. And I think there's something weird about that because, of course, it looks like, well, moderation and compromise then is just kind of where truth happens. And it might be the case that, no, there's something wrong about the view that's being offered, and the moderate view actually then is just a extreme rejection of the wrongness. So I'm not a big fan of the idea of moderation, but I do like the idea of saying the religions themselves should be imminently invested in critiquing that dangerous notion of religion.
Okay. Jeff?
Yeah, I really liked what Aaron did with the comma in his paper at the end, third section. I'm very sort of sympathetic to that, but I'm trying to remember the formulation you used about, what was it, sort of religion, sort of the ending of religion as a prerequisite for faith is what you reject.
That's what I reject, yeah.
And And so I was thinking about that in connection with your comment about sort of whether it's a good or bad thing that religion ends. And I don't think this is a kind of punting of the question, but I was trying to sort of make a case in the first part of my paper that the end of religion is not a good or bad thing. It happens, whether we want it to or not. So the way in which sort of faith is conceived, the way in which we understand sort of God, religiosity, the way in which we practice our faith, these things are always kind of reinventing themselves. So there's a whole series of endings and beginnings that sort of take place. And I don't want to make any sort of moral valuation of that sort of being good or bad. What I do want to suggest is that there are untapped resources within any and every religion that can be resourced, that can be exploited. And oftentimes the sort of dominant tradition within a given faith tends to sort of prevail, and where people are feeling sort of alienated or ostracized or disenchanted, the fact that sort of they don't know that these sort of imminent options exist within a given tradition, I think is the great failure in how we talk about religion, practice religion, and sort of think theologically.
Okay, thank you. Meryl?
If you think about race relationships in the United States, it's easy to identify what many of us, I hope, would call bad religion and good religion. Slavery was justified religiously, and many of the most vigorous defenders of slavery did so as part of their Christian worldview. On the other hand, the anti-slavery movement, both in England and here in the United States, was very often led by a Christian faith. When you get to the civil rights movement, the same thing is true. Some of the most deeply residual anti-black racism back in the 50s and 60s, and I'm afraid even to the present day, although it's less overt, less confessional, is closely relied to certain forms of religion. Whereas again, the civil rights movement was led by a coalition of Christian ministers and Jewish rabbis and many of their followers, and was in a very large sense a religious movement. So if we're talking about whether the death of religion is a good or a bad thing, it depends on what kind of religion you're talking about and where you stand as to whether those different kinds are good things or bad things. But the factual question, it seems to me, that leads to the talk about the death of religion is partly triggered by the Gallup poll and other polls that tell us that in Europe, which for centuries was Christendom, church attendance is way down. And that even here in the United States, where church attendance has been fairly stable, there are fewer and fewer people each time the question is asked who identify themselves with any particular religious tradition. And in that sense, there is a secularization that is an observable sociological fact about Europe and the United States. At the same time, especially here in the United States, certain kinds of religion have become more and more vocal and more aggressive and are anything but dying out. And so it's a very mixed story factually, whether religion is disappearing or whether it's becoming more importantly a part of our culture. And in some respects, both stories are true.
Thank you. Okay.
When Jake told me this, the title of the conference, I said, well, that's a pun, right? The end of religion. And he said, yes, this is a pun. I said, well, you should have meant the ends in the plural of religion. And then everybody would get the joke. It's a joke. The ends, of course, meaning both terminatio, cessation, but also telos. Right? So the English word end does both those things. And in the first sense of terminatio, of finishing it off, or the death of religion, I always like to say, when Nietzsche announced the death of God or the death of religion, a funny thing happened on the way to the funeral. Namely, it got reinvented on the way to the funeral. Second thing, but then if you look at the other sense, what's its end or purpose? It's telos. Then I like to think, well, I think of my youth, and JFK saying, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Well, what's the end of religion? Well, ask not what religion can do for you, but or what you can do for religion, but what religion does for you. What kinds of transformations it's capable of affecting. And in that case, then I think you got to talk about religious life occurs where ends are suspended. That is to say, where you're dealing with something of unconditional value. And then I like to go back to the medieval mystics and to Meister Eckhart and the Beguines and this notion of living without why. So in a certain sense, the end of religion is the end of ends. It's the end free dwelling in the sphere of the unconditional.
Okay, so before we move on to questions from social media and from people in the room, there is this sense where the title of the seminar could be a megachurch sermon series. Right, so it's that relationship versus religion sort of concept. And most of the people, you guys are talking, I say guys literally, you guys are talking about something that for many people is, I go to mosque or synagogue or temple or church every week, and yet it's really difficult to define what you're talking about in the context of religion if you mean day-to-day sort of praxis. So how does this that you're talking about relate to day-to-day praxis? Jack, you get to start.
At least he didn't ask you to talk about them.
You can start with somebody else.
Jack, he didn't ask you 90 seconds to talk about what the Beguines are. So I think you made it all pretty easy. So.
Should I begin with the Beguines?
This is about the end of the Beguines.
The Beguines and the end. What was the question? Well, I actually think that all of this has very, very, very profound applications, and it really is a matter of properties. I actually think it's not a question of applying this theory to properties. It's a question of getting the theory to catch up to the properties, because the properties is there, properties is in place, and it's. I'll actually talk about it. Come to my talk tomorrow, and I'll explain this whole thing. I think that what postmodern theory is saying is that religion is not a matter of theory. It has to do with the form of life. Right. It is a form of life, and the theory is articulating something that's going on. It's also, I don't think it can be dealt with in terms of propositions and proving propositions true and false, or kicking people out of church because they got their propositions wrong. I think it is that very proxies. And then tomorrow, my talk will be a little example of just why I think that's the case.
Okay, thank you. Mary?
I agree with what Jack just said to a certain extent, that religion is a way of life, wherever it is taken seriously at all. But a way of life, it seems to me, is an integration of beliefs and practices. And so beliefs are important, not simply as ends in themselves, but because of the role they play in shaping the practices. And the practices are important not entirely for them on their own account, but also because of the way they support the beliefs. And so the two work together. If one has a religion where the beliefs and practices are relevant one day a week and irrelevant on the other 6 days, then that might be what I like to call Census Bureau religion. If the Census Bureau asks you to check off one of the boxes, what are you? You check it off. Or if you're running for Congress, for sure, you check off one of the boxes. We have one, by the way, now in the House of Representatives who claims no religious identity. It's the first time it's happened in recent time. Even before we got to that, we had somebody who self-identified as a Muslim. But now there's at least one who has no religious identity. But that kind of running for Congress or Census Bureau religion, it seems to me, is a very truncated form. And unless those beliefs and practices filter down and shape my everyday life by shaping who I am, shaping my identity, then it seems to me that we're not talking about religion in a very deep sense. Of course, what difference it makes to my daily life depends on what religion I'm affiliated with. Affiliated isn't the right word there. I am shaped by.
Good. Jeff?
Yeah, building on what Meryl just said, there was I think the study was that Americans would be more inclined to vote for a Muslim president than someone who didn't identify with any religion whatsoever, than a self-proclaimed atheist. And that's, I'm not saying either one is what it is, good or bad, but it's just the degree to which there's a kind of expectation of our politicians to identify with a kind of normative sense of religiosity. It's pretty overwhelming when you consider the kind of levels of fear and Islamophobia that exist out in mainstream culture. That's not my answer, though. I think I have two answers to the question as I remember it. The first one is, I guess, a little bit autobiographical. And when I was still an undergraduate, I was a history major. I wasn't. I was sort of, I guess, sort of deeply religious, and I was trying to sort of make sense of my faith. In some ways, I felt a little bit kind of constrained, and I think as Aaron was talking about, trying to sort of figure out ways in which I could sort of be unapologetically an intellectual, like to kind of have a thinking faith, to recognize that was okay to ask questions. And to me, the kind of moment of liberation was not by kind of stepping outside of religion and sort of finding these kind of external critiques that would sort of dismantle or dismiss it. But instead, it was kind of understanding more of the tradition of Christianity itself. So the more deeply I studied the history of Christianity, specifically for me at the time it was sort of Protestant thought and sort of Martin Luther, the more I realized that the kind of the faith as I understood it was very limiting. And so it was this kind of imminent opening up of the tradition that all of a sudden helped me recognize the almost kind of infinitude of possibilities, this kind of deep reservoir within the tradition. And I think that's where this stuff is practical. And that's in sort of much of my work is trying to sort of accent, highlight, sort of lift up some of those traditions that within the tradition that aren't as readily known. And so that leads to my second question, or second answer to this question. I think when you look at those Gallup polls and the big headlines from the most recent Gallup poll was the number of nuns, which I reference in my paper, or non-affiliated religious people, people who identify themselves as spiritual but not religious or don't identify with any specific religious affiliation. That doubled in the most recent poll, and so that got all the headlines. And to me, that in some ways it obviously sort of polling is problematic, but it sort of presents a kind of false choice to people. Either you are this or you're not, right? And it's the problem, it's the reason why I'm sort of drawn to radical theology. That when I say sort of Adimo says that the death of God liquidates the philosophical basis for atheism, it's it's instead of sort of thinking about sort of God this way or this way, it's either you accept this and all the kind of baggage that goes along with it, or you must be an atheist. So there are kind of these third options, a kind of non-theistic way of sort of thinking about God. And so to me, this is immensely practically important in the sense that it provides a kind of existential kind of lifeline for people who don't sort of like the kind of simplistic answers that they might have been offered up.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think my colleagues are all saying things with which I would agree. So I'll hit sort of 3 points that maybe just emphasize some of the things they've already said. One, I think Merrill's right to say that religion as a form of life, maybe not distinctively, but at least, maybe not uniquely, but at least distinctively, has both cognitive and non-cognitive aspects. So this is where a quote from Kierkegaard that I used in my paper where it says, I'm not really concerned about knowing, except that knowing precedes action, right? So it does seem to me, like yesterday when I drove from South Carolina to Philadelphia, it was really important that I know which is the best way to go, because the practice that I'm engaged in, driving to Philadelphia, would be radically dangerous if all I did was say, just go west. Right? I'd call you from New Mexico. I can't find the place. Where is it? So I think that knowledge has to be part of this. The question is then, what terms do we use? And this is where I actually think really good stuff comes out of hardcore analytic philosophy of religion about, well, what do we mean by knowledge, and what kind of knowledge? And is it knowledge by acquaintance, like I know how to do something? Is it knowledge by relation, the way that I would say, well, I know my wife? Is it propositional knowledge, which is what Jack's worried about? I know that X, Y, and Z is the case. And it seems to me that parts of all these different knowings go into something like the form of life that is religious existence. How they cash out, I think, again, often will slide one type of knowledge versus another type of knowledge, depending on, again, the particular religious community. Unfortunately, the religious communities in which I have largely existed tend to operate according to what I sometimes refer to as a litmus test conception of knowledge or religious belief, where it is this, can you check these boxes, as Merrill said. And one of the things that happens in all the conversations I've had with pastors who then say, and again, I should say this publicly, I think all the pastors that have sort of encouraged me to leave their churches have done so in a bizarrely pastoral way. Like they're trying genuinely to sort of help me find a place that fits me better. So I don't see this as like vicious on their part at all. Again, I think it's a problem. I wish it weren't the case. But I don't think they're doing this because they hate me. I think they're actually trying to be a good shepherd to the flock to whom they serve, right? So the last thing I'll say about that is, if litmus tests, conceptions of belief and religious knowing are problematic for all kinds of reasons that Jack and Merrill and Jeff have all pointed to, I think it's important to recognize non-cognitive aspects. So the practical stuff that we do will shape then the kinds of beliefs and knowledge claims that are possible for us. This is what William James sometimes talks about as you have to have live belief options. So the example I'll give here is I have a 5.5-year-old son, Atticus, and Atticus is right now forming the way of life that will give rise to the beliefs that he will find himself, struggling with or having to get therapy later to overcome or something. And so where I go to church and where I take him to church, he's in coloring and making cotton ball angels and stuff. And yet it's creating for him a mode of practice by which some beliefs will either be live or not live for him. So I think it's important to see we are responsible for both of these sides. But yet I don't just say, well, hey, this is true, try it out. I'm actually interested in, well, what is it this church says about what is true of God and what it says is true of moral life, etc., so that I can make sure it's the kind of place that holds beliefs that I think will yield the form of life that will then form the kinds of beliefs I think that are plausible for him, right? It's that constant back and forth.
Good. Okay, so I'm going to ask y'all for questions. And here's the deal. If you ask for a specific response, whether it's Jack or Merrill or whoever, I'm going to ask for the sort of oppositional other to have a response, but we don't probably have time at this point to do all four at a time. So just first hands, and we go. There you go, sir. this is for anyone to answer. I'll go from the comment you made about the boxes, the ideas in the boxes about religion, and the litmus test. Isn't part of the definition of religion precisely that there is a litmus test? And that litmus test is the core of its continuity, the continuity of its narrative. And how, if you're going to bring postmodernism into the mix, how's that going to work?
I think it's a sort of a sociological fact that if you're going to have a community, it has to have a fairly specific identity. And one of the ways in which religious communities have their identity is in terms of shared beliefs. And in that sense, it seems to me inescapable and not necessarily a bad thing that various religious communities define themselves in terms of various beliefs and various practices, both in their hopefully coherent interrelation, and say, this is who we are. And the two caveats that seem to me to need to go with that are first, to borrow a term from Aaron, the hermeneutical humility that I am not the only, we are not the only community on earth. In opera, every once in a while you get what's called a Finks quartet or a sextet or octet, and 3 or 4 or 5 singers will come up and line up across the stage, and they will pour out their heart, and they will tell you what they're thinking at this time. And in accordance with the operatic convention, they will act as if no one else is on the stage, because they are giving you what's going on inside their mind. They're not talking to each other. They're talking to us. That's sort of, we are the people and wisdom will die with us. It seems to me, at least in a postmodern context, is inappropriate for any religious community, and therefore in various ways there need to be various kinds of ecumenism. The other caveat, it seems to me, is the need for such communities to find a way to be welcoming to those who are already insiders. And I remember one pastor expressing this in a way that I thought was really Solomonic. Somebody came and said, well, you know, I really feel at home in this congregation. I like the worship. I even like the sermons. But there's this part of the denominational creed that I really had trouble with. And it may have been the Apostles' Creed for all I remember of the story. And he said, oh, that's okay. He says, that's the faith of the church. Appropriate as much of it as you can and worship with us in the meantime. And he didn't make it a litmus test in the sense of, unless you can sign on, it's all or nothing. My mother was an all or nothing Christian. And when I came to have some doubts about some of the things that were included in her all, she tended to write me off. I'm grateful for the fact that my faith survived that. I know that there are people whose faith has not survived that kind of exclusiveness. You're either 100% with us or forget about it. You're excommunicated. And so that's the second caveat.
Jack?
I like the way you put it, because you put it in terms of some kind of continuity. I think that everybody up here, all 4 of us, are really interested in hermeneutics, and I think hermeneutics is exactly the right sort of thing you need need to have some kind of tradition or some kind of continuity, so long as that continuity, because it keeps the tradition open and self-reinventing, and it allows the thing to move. If the death of a tradition is to fix it or to freeze it, and so it has to be a process of endless reinvention. But if it reinvents itself in such a way that it's unrecognizable with its predecessor forms, then it's just created another tradition and it's going off in another direction. But when you look back over a tradition, you can see how it will have been, how it has been, how it has turned out to be, to have been a tradition. For example, what's Christianity? Christianity is the memory and the promise of Jesus. That's the way I like to put it. It's the memory and the promise. And that memory is constantly being recalled in new ways. And that promise is constantly being rethought in new ways. And the whole history of that thing, however it will have turned out to be, is what it will mean. So in hermeneutics, a thing doesn't so much have a meaning as it has a history. And that history has a kind of non-programmable continuity. And I think hermeneutics is, and particularly a sort of hermeneutic deconstruction, is the only way to make that work. Otherwise, the thing it'll freeze and it'll become exclusionary, or it will just dissipate.
Questions? Yes, sir.
So this is at least for Dr. Robbins. Others have answers, that's great. And I don't mean for this to be divisive amongst you, but hopefully it's clarifying. One of the characteristics of radical theology that you was that it's political. And I was wondering if we looked at Aaron's account for faith, in the postmodern age, and sort of the not necessarily meaning this approach or that approach, if that is compatible with radical theology, in that radical theology is political and maybe therefore communally active or like an activist sort of movement.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think this is a larger question about sort of postmodernism too, in which there have been any number of critics, especially over the last 10 years or so, who kind of suggested that kind of postmodern deconstruction leads to a kind of either kind of political decisionism or a kind of political quietism. I think certainly people have given good answers to why that isn't necessarily the case. But I think movements like speculative realism, sort of new materialism, these are efforts to try to say concretely what sort of postmodernism might have been reticent to say, sort of to make sort of declarations, to take stands. And so, so I got at that in my paper by way of Paul Kahn and sort of a kind of critique of liberal procedurism, in which you have sort of endless deliberation, sort of with the kind of hope for eventual agreement, which might never come, but meantime you do have to make sort of calculations and decisions. And so I am sort of wanting to suggest that so radical theology is not betraying itself by expressing a kind of preferential political option. And that's one way of kind of tying it sort of to liberation theology. But it's also to try to kind of push it sort of beyond its comfort zone. And so, I think there is a real tension there. I don't know. I don't have a better answer for you. I think you've got your finger on sort of the pulse of where a lot of this sort of really interesting sort of debate is happening right now. And I'm sympathetic to the question.
Okay, 60 seconds. Why is the time for it? And then Aaron's going to respond to the question.
Why is Kant important? And I think sort of Kant's been the most, as people have begun to sort of think about sort of questions about the relationship between religion and politics, sort of proper relationship between religion and politics, and as political theology has emerged as this kind of burgeoning discourse of interest. Sort of Kant, I think, has been sort of the best interpreter of what Carl Schmitt is about, who was the kind of the person who defined political theology as an alternative to modern liberalism, and a kind of a way of talking about civil religion in such a way that you kind of see the kind of religious or sort of theological underpinnings to the social and political fabric of our everyday lives. So that's, I think, that's
60 seconds.
So as I understand the question, maybe it's just a part of it, but this is the part that I'll speak to, because I think what Jeff said, quite a bit of it I'm actually very sympathetic to. I like the fact that Jeff is saying, look, there might be these preferential options, both ethically, politically, maybe even, I think, metaphysically, relative to certain types of, in the way my language, anti-realism in some cases is sort of preferable to other types of realism. In his language, speculative realism might be kind of where that comes together, right? But the end of your question, I think, was something like this. So is radical theology compatible with the sort of faith that I've described as lived out, in a postmodern age? My answer here is yes, if the radical theology is not necessarily just another name for the subjectivist solution, which I don't think it has to be. A lot hangs on sort of the weeds. I sort of bracketed in my paper. There's lots in the weeds here, right? It's where the snakes hang out. It's also usually where the rabbits hang out. I mean, it's both the place where we find protection. It's also the place where we are able to ambush. And so, Jack and I actually have a debate in print where I suggest that maybe weak theology is just another version of strong theology. It's just one that looks a whole lot more tolerant and liberal and, generally sort of progressive. And Jack's response, which I think is entirely sensible, is, look, I don't take what I'm doing to be a sort of first order account of what is true about God. I take it to be what's going on in the accounts that we give about things that are true about God, right? So the way that he and I both will refer to this is it's a second order discourse, right? And what I'm worried about is that second order discourse smuggling in a first order discourse. I think he and I ultimately, and maybe I don't know where Jeff stands on this, which would be interesting. I think maybe Jack and I sort of disagree about how much there is there. But I have no problem saying if this is a first order account, but it's just a kind of very progressive, very liberal, very cosmopolitan, maybe even sort of generally neo-Marxist or whatever.
The word is weak.
What? Or weak. It's weak. I mean, if it's that stuff, I actually think, cool. Like that's another account of that's another kind of faith. Right? Being a communist, in a postmodern world is, I think, a kind of living out a sort of orientation toward an ultimate concern about a particular notion of justice. So I guess that's my answer. Right? It's just, I think it depends if this is the subjectivist solution, I'm out. If it's an attempt itself to find that interesting third option, which I said there might be a bunch of others, I think maybe that more substantivist account of radical theology might be another option. It's probably one I'm not going to agree with all the way down, but I think it absolutely is another version of postmodern faith. Absolutely.
Okay, so I promise that tomorrow night we're going to make them define God. Literally, we're going to start tomorrow night, and actually, are making up to yourself first order, second order accounts. You're also defining that tomorrow night. So we'll do the question one word, and then we'll do all four of you to answer the question that came in via the internet, which I actually kind of like. So who would like to have a question?
Thanks. I think this question is for Jeff, but for anyone, but I would note for Jack, Villanova won by 2. So.
My parents are here tonight, and during my paper they were listening to the LSU. So they're very proud of it back there, even though LSU lost back there.
So I'm not happy, but so I'm with Jack. So my question was going to be, so I'm going to mention a philosopher. So Gadamer, and the reason I think it's important is when he talks about what goes on in a kind of modern project. He talks about kind of, the broad projection of authority in the modern project, and I think also he doesn't talk about the second part that I mentioned, but like the kind of I think he said something about exile from ecclesial settings or something along those lines, and I wonder, and that's I think part actually also of the kind of modern product. So I wonder if this kind of detachment from authority and kind of detachment from ecclesial authorities or scriptural authorities or what have you, if that is not in fact not postmodern but rather a continuation of the modern. So I guess 2 more questions. So is that, and then is there a place in postmodern reflections on theology for authority?
That's actually such a good question. All 4 of you to answer. That'll be it. That's really good. Who wants to start? Jack?
Yeah, Jack starts.
That's what you get from being on the far right, Jack.
The authority for me is the authority of what Derrida calls, and I call within the event. So the authority is the authority of what is addressing us, what interrupts us, what discomforts us, what causes us trouble, and sets us back on our heels. What gets relativized in that account is the stabilized and handed down authorities of institutions and in the case of religion, not only religious institutions but academic institutions. And so radical theology has a much better chance. Radical theology for me has to do with the events that underline religious beliefs. Okay? And that you just get a better result doing radical theology if you're not going to lose your job because of what you said. I just think that's a fact. And so radical theology operates more. It can only operate under very open conditions and very loose ones. Now, it's the Enlightenment. It doesn't simply continue modernity, because modernity was only interested in extricating itself from the authority of revelation. Postmodernism is also interested in extricating itself from the authority of what calls itself reason. Right? It's trying to have a more reasonable idea of reason and a more enlightened idea of the enlightenment and a more revelatory sense of revelation. So it's moving. It's trying to sort of get beneath the radar of both reason and revelation and deal with something more elemental. But it doesn't mean that it's on its own, or that it's just simply emotivist.
I think in this respect, that postmodernism is a continuation of modernity, insofar as modernity is an attempt to extricate itself from revelation and from a church and a state which tried to make themselves absolute by an appeal to revelation. I think Jack is quite right that reason itself came to be seen as something from which one needed to be extricated, or at least to have it redefined. So there's a broader scope to the thing, but there is a continuing attempt to displace authority on the part of many postmodern thinkers. And my own view is that all all the versions of postmodernism, and tomorrow I'll present what I call a big tent conception of the postmodern, that all of them place constraints on the kinds of meta comments we can make about our beliefs and practices, but do not have substantive authority over those beliefs and practices. Now, of course, if you take the writings of Derrida or the writings of, name anybody, as a totality, there are substantive commitments in them. What I'm suggesting is that the distinctively postmodern, the things that identify them as postmodern, have to do with the status of our beliefs and practices and not their content. And for me, those postmodern qualifications are compatible with a very traditional mere Christianity. And for mere Christianity, there is a very important place for authority. Sometimes that's the authority of Scripture alone. Sometimes it's the authority of Scripture and tradition. Sometimes it's the authority of Scripture and tradition and the magisterium. But none of those, it seems to me, are inherently incompatible with the epistemic constraints that distinguish postmodernism from modernity's conception of reason, from which postmodernists are trying to extricate themselves.
In some ways, what I hear both Jack and Meryl saying is postmodernism is a continuation and radicalization of the modern crisis of authority. And oftentimes that's put in sort of negative terms, the collapse of meta-narratives. I mean, what I tried to suggest in my paper is you can't spin this positively. It's not a sort of a collapse of meta-narratives, but sort of a proliferation, an explosion of different meta-narratives. But then the issue is that once you have these competing authorities making claims on you, that's its own crisis of authority. And in some sense, that's the end of religion, or de facto the death of God, right? Once you are in a position in which you are forced to sort of pick and choose which authorities are going to be operative, you're sort of putting yourself in the place that sort of religious authority once sort of claimed as its prerogative, right? So I take that question seriously. I mean, what I try to describe in my paper, which I think you're picking up on, is this sense of radical theology facing this double exile or double displacement. I mean, it's not really welcome in the church for I guess obvious reasons, maybe not good reasons, but obvious reasons. And it's not really welcome in the academy either. And so can you have a rhetorical strategy that makes a virtue out of that necessity, in which you kind of recognize the kind of freedom in that kind of, that sort of no place, never land. And I think that's where, someone like Charles Winquist, which I mentioned, is really interesting, the kind of minor intensive use of a major discourse. And the last thing I say, and I don't think this needs explanation, but Deleuze said that it's only our age that discovered theology, which is such a kind of crazy thing to say, right? I mean, it's in the appendix of Logic and Sense, and so now sort of theology can become what theology is meant to be only after we sort of abandon certain conceptions of what theology ought to be. So I think that's where that kind of crisis of authority works within radical theology.
Let me try to answer this by weaving a couple threads together. I actually find a lot of help in thinking about authority from Nicholas Wolterstorff, who has a sort of inverted Kantian book, right, which is called, Reason Within the Bounds of Religion Alone. And what Wolterstorff claims there, and I've said this repeatedly in my writing, sort of one of those things I quote kind of in everything, because I try to show, hey, here's a hardcore analytic philosopher of religion doing the stuff that we think you have to mention Heidegger and Deleuze to get to, right? He says, quote, "We are all profoundly historical creatures." And why that's important is he links it to the idea of what counts as evidence for us. And so I would say, of course there's got to be a space for authority in postmodernism, or we couldn't make sense of what an argument would look like. Right? I don't know what it would mean to defend postmodernism as the best way forward, or radical theology is the best way forward, or Merrill's account of a sort of Kierkegaardian view, or Jack's account of a different Kierkegaardian view, unless they're going to give reasons for why they think this is the best, idea on offer. But we always appeal to some sort of authority when we do that. The question is, well, what status do those authorities have? Are they unquestionable, or are they themselves background conditions, forms of life maybe even, out of which things like data is possible, out of which things like arguments are able to be given? And if they are that latter thing, which is what Wolterstorff argues, he calls control beliefs, these sort of authorities by which our evidence and data becomes possible, then what we can realize is, kind of like in an idea of scientific paradigm revolution, eventually we might get so much data and evidence internal to a particular authority structure that it causes us to challenge that authority structure. So I, in my Kierkegaardian postmodern self, want to say there is nothing absolutely off the table for existing human inquirers, existing human people. There's nothing off the table when it comes to that possibility of itself coming back into play as the question. But the only way it could come back into possibility as the questioned is if we've now allowed some other commitment or non-cognitive practice or form of life or influence to then be functioning authoritatively such that the question could be asked as a question. Nietzsche even has this great line, which I've never found, and maybe my distinguished colleagues can tell me where it is, but David Wood at Vanderbilt used to quote this all the time. He would say, look, God's not dead so long as we still believe in grammar. So, look, authority, we're using sentences that have semantic content and syntactical structure according to the authority of something called, general English. Of course we've got authority structures in play. We couldn't talk without them. But we can then question. I gave a talk once in Maine, and I said, how y'all doing? Thanks so much for having me. And they started laughing. And I was like, I'm sorry, I missed them. You said, y'all. Of course I did. That's the way I speak, And it was like I had broken some big rule there, Or like when I used to wear ball caps when I taught at Swanee. It was just like something you don't do, So, I think, of course, we use authority structures. The point is, as postmodernists, and I want to then suggest, also, maybe even as a determinate, identified with a tradition Christian, those authority structures are always put into question. That's what I was trying to show by, look, even the Hebrew Bible and New Testament is deeply invested in the task of those things that were off the table, let's bring them back to focus. I think that's super important.
All right. 60 seconds each to close. This is a good question. It came through the internet. I do want to deal with it. I know this is the last one I lied. This is the last one. But you only get 60 seconds. Postmodernity has been seen primarily as a corrective to certain things about religion and Christianity, wherever you want to phrase it. What are the affirmative, positive use of postmodernity in a religious structure? And Aaron, 60 seconds each, all the way down.
I'm going to answer in a really weird way. Merrill said that his mother was an all-or-nothing kind of person, and he is thankful he didn't, in some sense, lose his faith internal to that relationship. My grandfather, to whom I've also dedicated a book, I'm sorry, Vanessa, is the reason, to be honest, why Pentecostalism will not get off the table for me. And it's because he was a Pentecostal preacher in the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, who never let appeals to authority stop conversations. It was always, but why do you think that? Well, what do you think it could mean? Well, why is it that we take the Bible seriously? This is what Sunday afternoons looked like for me, and he was the Pentecostal pastor. So because that's what I had as my background, the idea of saying, so what's the affirmative content of postmodernism? Again, I'm not sure there's a whole lot of affirmative, except in the sense of we live in worlds, and these worlds are complicated and messy, and paying attention to that will always require us to have a sort of question mark everywhere sort of mentality toward what we hold to be true.
That was at least 90 seconds. Sorry.
I'll be brief. I think it's affirmative in the sense that it's true. And I'll leave it at that.
In Henry IV, Part 2, King Henry IV famously says, "Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown." And the negative message of postmodernism is that I am not God, I am not the center, we are not God, we are not the center, and that's good news. That takes away from us a burden that we cannot possibly fulfill, and it makes us much worse than we could possibly imagine whenever we try to occupy that place that doesn't belong to us.
I think postmodernism is a theory that all of our beliefs and practices are constructed. They are historically, socially, politically, incarnately, in every other possible way, constructed, and consequently deconstructible. Therefore, what drives postmodernism, what makes postmodernism to be what it is that it's the affirmation of the undeconstructible in all of our constructions. And the undeconstructible is never constructed. Once it's constructed, it's deconstructible. But what's driving the construction, what makes it happen, what moves history, what takes over, is some kind of obscure desire, premonition, intimation, hope for the undeconstructible. Postmodern theory, as I see it, is fundamentally theory of hope, and its fundamental, its maxim is fundamentally affirmative. Come, yes, yes. Bien, oui, oui. Deconstruction is affirmation.